Upon seeing the blind millionaire at the altar, the bride fled, and his maid took her place. What he did surprised everyone. William Anderson was an imposing figure in the business world of Denver. Known for his ability to turn any venture into gold, he had reached what many considered the peak of life: fortune, power, and recognition. His penthouse in the heart of the city was a symbol of his successful trajectory, decorated with the finest things money could buy. But even surrounded by luxury, he often felt an unease he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was loneliness, disguised as independence, or exhaustion, masked as ambition. That morning, as the sun illuminated Denver's skyscrapers, William was reviewing the reports of his latest acquisition. Emily, his assistant, entered with her usual discretion, but with news. "Mr. Anderson, the invitation for the networking event in Miami has been confirmed. Would you like me to organize your schedule to include some rest time there?" William hesitated for a moment, something rare for him. "Yes, organize it. Maybe a few extra days will be a good idea." Days later in Miami, the scene was completely different. The ocean breeze replaced the air conditioning of his penthouse, and the sound of the waves muffled the noise of his relentless routine. Although he had traveled under the pretext of business, William knew something within him was searching for more than contracts and partnerships. He needed silence, answers, something his logical and methodical mind couldn't explain. On a particularly peaceful afternoon, he decided to walk along the beach. The fine sand molded under his feet, and the horizon seemed infinite. For the first time in years, William allowed himself to slow down. He watched children playing, couples walking hand in hand, and fishermen preparing their nets. He felt a pang of nostalgia, a distant memory of simpler times, before his life became an endless quest for unattainable goals. As the sun began to hide on the horizon, he stopped and stared at the sea. The vastness of the ocean seemed like a metaphor for his own life, immense, full of possibilities, but without direction. He wondered if all his accumulated achievements really fulfilled him, or if they were just distractions masking something deeper. His reverie was interrupted by a distant sound, almost imperceptible at first. He looked in the direction of the noise and saw a figure in the water struggling against the currents. For a moment he froze, trying to understand what was happening. The cry for help that followed was like a shock. William took off his shoes and ran toward the water without a second thought. The waves were stronger than he had anticipated, and each step seemed like a battle against the current. He swam with vigor, driven by an adrenaline that seemed to awaken something dormant inside him. When he finally reached the woman, he saw the desperation in her eyes. "Hold on to me!" he shouted, trying to keep her afloat. She tried to grab him, but she was too weak to offer any resistance. William had to use all his strength to keep them safe as he swam back to shore. Every meter was a fight against the sea and the growing fear of not making it, but he didn't give up. When he finally reached the sand, he fell to his knees, exhausted but relieved. The woman was unconscious, but breathing. He gently laid her down and checked her pulse, feeling the warmth of her body against the coolness of the sea breeze. A crowd began to form around them, but William noticed nothing except the sound of his own breathing and the irregular rhythm of the woman's heartbeat. William carried the woman in his arms to his beach chair, while the curious onlookers began to disperse. Her face was pale, her lips slightly trembling, and her breathing seemed to be stabilizing slowly. He asked one of the resort staff for a towel and carefully wrapped her in it, trying to keep her warm. "Can you hear my voice?" he asked gently, leaning in to observe her closely. She slowly opened her eyes, looking confused. "Where am I?" she murmured, her voice barely audible. "You're safe now," he replied. "My name is William. I brought you back to the beach. What's your name?" She hesitated for a moment, as if trying to remember. "Grace," she finally answered, her voice laden with fatigue. He noticed that she was still trembling, not just from the cold, but perhaps from the shock of what had just happened. William stood up and, without thinking twice, made a decision that would change the course of his trip. "Come with me. You need a place to rest." She looked at him, surprised by such a direct offer, but her exhaustion left no room for questioning. In the hotel room, he called room service and asked for something warm for her to eat and drink. Grace sat in an armchair near the window, gazing out at the sea as if she wanted to confront the element that had nearly taken her life. There was something in her posture that intrigued William. She seemed grateful, but distant, as though she was keeping something important to herself. "Are you feeling better?" he asked, handing her a cup of tea. "Yes, thank you," she replied with a faint smile. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did." William shook his head. "It was nothing. Anyone would have done the same." Grace turned her gaze away, something in her expression suggesting that she didn't share the same belief. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. He decided not to press her. Despite his growing curiosity, he knew this wasn't the right time. As the night wore on, Grace began to relax, but not entirely. Her movements were restrained, her words measured. At one point, William asked, "What were you doing out in the sea so far from the shore?" I was swimming. I lost track of time and got caught in the currents," she replied, but her voice had a slight tremor that didn't go unnoticed. There was something in the way she avoided his gaze that made him question the truth of her words. Although her answers raised doubts, William felt a growing compassion for her. When Grace finally let her guard down and sighed deeply, he saw something different, a genuine vulnerability. She seemed exhausted from fighting, not just against the sea, but against something bigger. "You don't need to tell me anything now," he said, breaking the silence. "Just rest. The important thing is that you're okay." Grace lifted her eyes, as if those words had disarmed her defenses. "Thank you, William. I don't know how I would have made it on my own." That night, while she slept in the guest room he had prepared for her, William stood on the balcony, gazing at the stars. He couldn't stop thinking about her. Who was Grace, and what had brought her to this point? The pieces of the puzzle didn't fit, but he felt there was something more behind her tired eyes. Despite his suspicions, he realized that a connection was beginning to form, something unexpected and inexplicable. If you're watching until here, I'm sure you're enjoying it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel. William watched Grace from a distance as she walked along the hotel balcony with a lightness that seemed to contradict the vulnerability she had shown the night before. Still deep in his thoughts, he tried to understand the contradictions that arose with every new interaction with her. During breakfast, a seemingly trivial detail caught his attention. "You have a precise cut on the apple. Any special technique?" William commented, trying to disguise his growing mistrust with casual conversation. "Oh, it's nothing," she replied with a rehearsed smile. "I swam professionally for a few years. I had to prepare my meals carefully." The comment, made almost absent-mindedly, froze William for a moment. He disguised his surprise, but the words echoed in his mind. A professional swimmer. How could someone with such a skill have been dragged so easily by the currents? He wasn't an expert, but something didn't add up. Later, while walking by the pool area, William overheard a conversation between hotel staff that caught his attention. "The woman from the rescue. I've heard they've seen her here before, but always alone." "There's something strange about her," whispered one of the waiters. Although he didn't want to pay attention to rumors, the doubt had already been planted. He began to observe Grace more carefully, and the more he paid attention, the more he noticed small inconsistencies. Once, while they were talking about travels, she mentioned having visited a place that contradicted her previous story about financial struggles. At another point, when talking about her stay, she hesitated when explaining how she had arrived at that hotel. An opportunity to confront her arose when William, still trying to act cautiously, directly asked about her experience as a swimmer. "You said you swam professionally. It's surprising you had such a hard time in the sea." Grace turned her gaze away and laughed nervously. "Oh, it was a long time ago. I'm rusty." But the explanation didn't convince him. Something about her seemed more calculated than natural. The pieces didn't fit, and he couldn't ignore the contradictions. When he left her alone in the room to go to an appointment, William decided to investigate discreetly. At the front desk, he casually asked about Grace. "Do you know anything about the woman I'm hosting in my room? She's an acquaintance, but I lost contact with her years ago." The receptionist hesitated before replying. "I shouldn't say anything, Mr. Anderson, but some people say she's been here frequently, usually alone and discreet. Some speculate well, maybe she's looking for opportunities." William's blood ran cold. What was that? He returned to the room more alert than ever, but didn't mention anything. Grace greeted him with a warm smile, which he now saw as just another piece of a puzzle he couldn't put together. That night, while she slept, William reflected on everything that had happened since the moment he rescued her. The details, once small, now seemed to shout. The skill as a swimmer, the evasive behavior, the rumors. The possibility that all of it could be a setup left him uneasy. What if he was being manipulated? He decided to distance himself. The next morning, he told her that he would have to leave for urgent business, but left instructions for the hotel to take care of her. Grace, although visibly uncomfortable, didn't insist. "I hope we can see each other again, William." He forced a smile. "Of course, we'll meet." As the car drove him away, William felt torn between doubt and guilt. He had been genuine in his help, but now he realized there might be much more beneath the surface of that mysterious woman. Days after William's abrupt departure, Grace decided to take the initiative. She got his contact through the hotel and sent a brief message, thanking him for everything and suggesting a meeting to clarify any misunderstandings. Though polite, William's response was brief, indicating he was busy with work commitments. For Grace, it was clear that he was avoiding any closeness. Determined to break that barrier, she unexpectedly appeared at one of the beaches he frequented, where she knew he would be. William saw her approaching with firm steps, but his expression didn't show surprise. He had already expected she wouldn't give up so easily. "William, can we talk?" Grace began, her voice carrying a mixture of courage and hesitation. He gestured for her to sit beside him on the sand, but kept an emotional distance. "Grace, I don't know what you expect me to say." She swallowed, trying to mask her discomfort. "I want to understand what happened. One day, you seemed willing to help, and the next, you completely pushed me away." William turned his face to the horizon, where the waves broke gently. "Things aren't always so simple. Not everything is as it seems." Grace leaned slightly forward, trying to catch his gaze. "If you have something to say, be direct." He finally looked at her, his expression now cold. "I don't know who you really are, Grace. There are too many contradictions in what you say and do. It seems like you're always hiding something, and I don't trust enigmas." The words cut like blades, and she instinctively pulled back. Trying to disguise the impact, Grace adopted a defensive, almost arrogant tone. "I didn't expect this from you, William. I thought you were different, but it seems you're just like everyone else, quick to judge and slow to try to understand." William laughed without humor. "Different? Maybe I was for a moment. But something tells me you expected me to be blind, not noticing the holes in your stories." The tension between them was palpable, and the beach breeze seemed to carry the weight of an oppressive silence. Grace, feeling cornered, lifted her chin in a gesture of false confidence. "You think you know everything about me? You have no idea what I've been through." "And why didn't you tell me? Why weren't you honest from the start?" William interrupted, his voice growing firmer. "The truth is, I'm tired of games, Grace. I've lived too much to know that trust isn't built on half-truths." She abruptly stood up, her eyes shining with contained emotion. "Maybe you've never truly lived, William. Maybe all this security of yours is just a facade to hide how afraid you are to take a risk with something real." The words hung in the air, heavy, as she walked away, leaving him alone on the sand. He remained standing, staring at the sea, feeling torn. Something about it unsettled him deeply. Despite his doubts, there was an uncomfortable truth in what Grace had said. Hours later, sitting in the same spot, William reflected on the conversation. He had spent his whole life pursuing clear objectives, tangible goals, but true happiness always seemed to be on the outskirts, just out of reach. Grace, with all her mysteries and contradictions, represented a break in the logic of his controlled life. Perhaps that was what bothered him most. The 2 years that passed had transformed Grace significantly. Now she lived in a small coastal town, far from the glitz and turmoil that had once seemed to chase her. She worked discreetly as a receptionist at a community library, a quiet space that reflected her effort to remain reserved. The past still haunted her, but she had learned to mask her feelings with an outward calm. That morning, as she organized old books in the history section, the sound of a vibrating phone echoed across the counter. It was a colleague's phone, who had the habit of leaving it there while she moved around the building. Grace approached to silence it, but a headline caught her attention. "Businessman William Anderson announces engagement at intimate ceremony." The name struck her like an electric shock. It was impossible to ignore. Against her better judgment, her fingers hesitated for a moment before swiping across the screen, enlarging the image of the article. There he was, impeccably dressed, with the same imposing presence that once made her feel small at his side. On his arm, a confident woman smiled, as if asserting that she had everything under control. Grace felt a deep pang in her chest. It was as if the weight of all the memories she had tried to bury emerged all at once. It wasn't just the rescue that returned to her mind, but also the conversations, the glances full of tension, and the way he, even in his coldness, had awakened something in her that no one else had. Trying to control her breathing, she put the phone back on the counter and walked away, but the thoughts continued to haunt her. It was absurd, she knew. What they had lived was brief and marked by doubts and misunderstandings. Still, the idea of William moving on so easily disturbed her more than she was willing to admit. That night, lying in bed, Grace relived every moment of those days. How he had risked his life to save hers. How she had felt safe, even amidst the doubts that arose afterward, and how, despite everything, there was something unfinished between them. That feeling of incompleteness gnawed at her. She wondered if she should reach out to him. Maybe to explain, to show him who she really was. But what if it was pointless? He seemed happy, rebuilding his life with someone else. What could she offer him other than confusing memories and a past he would likely prefer to forget? Despite the questions tormenting her, a persistent desire grew inside her. The opportunity for a second chance, to show that she had changed and that there was still something between them, no matter how improbable it seemed. In her heart, she dreamed of the moment fate would bring them face to face again. Maybe this time, she could be more than just a mysterious woman with secrets that pushed him away. William was sitting in his living room, surrounded by wedding magazines, decoration samples, and endless guest lists. Victoria, his fiancée, was standing beside him, analyzing a color palette with a critical look. "I told you that champagne gold would be the best choice, William. What do you think? Or would you rather I decide everything on my own?" Her voice was cold, with no room for dialogue. He sighed and nodded, distracted. "As you prefer, Victoria. I trust your taste." But he didn't trust her. Not because Victoria was incompetent, but because the wedding they were planning felt more like a show for the world than a meaningful moment for the two of them. Every detail was designed to impress the guests, to solidify the image of a perfect couple. William was beginning to feel the weight of that perfection, suffocated by expectations that didn't seem like his own. The following days only reinforced his unease. Victoria always seemed busy with her own projects, making it clear that her priorities were different. William noticed how their conversations had turned transactional. She wanted something, and he gave in. He wanted company, and she offered superficiality. The engagement that had once seemed promising was now filled with distance. It was during one of these tumultuous weeks that the accident happened. William was driving home after a meeting, driving down a rain-soaked road. His thoughts were scattered, torn between the pressures of the wedding and the important decisions awaiting him at the company. A poorly calculated curve, a delayed reflex, and the deafening sound of impact filled the air. The car flipped and everything went dark. When William woke up in the hospital, the first thing he noticed was the silence. He tried to open his eyes, but all he saw was an impenetrable black veil. The doctor's voice came as a blow. "The loss of sight is temporary, Mr. Anderson. Your body needs time to recover." William's world collapsed. He had always been an independent man, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life. Now he depended on others, even for the simplest tasks. Victoria showed up at the hospital at the end of the first day, but her visit was brief. She kissed his forehead and said something about how hard it was to see him like that. "But you'll recover quickly, won't you? After all, we need to adjust the wedding dates." William remained silent, feeling more isolated than ever. In the weeks that followed, Victoria's emotional absence became more evident. She kept visiting him, but her presence was mechanical, without warmth or genuine concern. He heard her on the phone, complaining to her friends about how this was messing up the wedding plans. "It's like he's out of reach now. I don't know how to deal with this." The emptiness between them expanded. William spent hours alone, lost in his thoughts. His blindness forced him to notice things he had ignored before. Without the visual distraction, he began to reflect on what really mattered. The image he had built with Victoria was just that, a facade. There was no substance, no true love. Her lack of support during the hardest time of his life exposed a truth he feared to admit. Victoria's absence was almost as evident as the darkness that now filled William's world. Since the accident, his routine had been silent and monotonous, with only brief visits from his fiancée, always laden with formality and a sense of obligation. He heard the sound of her heels on the cold hospital floor, the creaking of the leather chair when she sat, and the restrained tone of her voice as she superficially asked about his progress. One day, after yet another of these mechanical visits, William had a revealing conversation with Emily, his loyal assistant, who had become a more constant presence than Victoria. "She didn't ask about the company reports this time?" Emily asked as she adjusted his pillows. William laughed without humor. "No, she's more concerned with the wedding date than with what's happening with me." Emily hesitated, but her loyalty to William urged her to continue. "If I may say so, sir, perhaps it's time to consider whether this relationship truly reflects who you are." These words echoed in William's mind. That night, as he faced the darkness of his blindness, he began to piece together his relationship with Victoria. The absence of emotional support, the constant emphasis on appearances, and the superficiality of their conversations began to weigh on his mind. The next day, Victoria appeared impeccably dressed, but with an impatience that was hard to conceal. "William, we need to talk about the wedding adjustments. The flowers I chose are no longer available, and I want to change the decorations. Can you imagine how it will look without the white orchids?" He sighed, feeling the emotional exhaustion tighten his chest. "Victoria, I can barely imagine what lies ahead of me right now." She ignored his tone, continuing as if he hadn't spoken. "I also thought about moving the venue to a more sophisticated destination. Maybe a wedding abroad? It will be more exclusive." William finally interrupted. "Victoria, do you even realize what's happening to me? I'm struggling to understand how my life will be from now on, and all you seem to see are the details of a ceremony that means little to me." She blinked, surprised, but didn't back down. "This is unfair. Of course, I care about you, but the wedding is important. We need to maintain a good image." That sentence was the last straw. William felt something inside him break. "Image? That's all that matters to you, isn't it? Not me, not what I'm going through, but how we look to others." Victoria, feeling attacked, crossed her arms defensively. "I didn't know you were so ungrateful, William. I'm trying to keep everything going while you're like this." He laughed, a bitter laugh. "Like this? Victoria, you see me as a problem, something that interferes with your perfect life. But you know what? You don't need to worry anymore. There won't be a wedding." Her shock was evident. "You're ending everything? After all we've invested in this?" "Yes," he replied, his voice firm, "because now I see who you really are." Victoria stormed out, her heels echoing like a hammer in the irrevocable decision William had just made. In the weeks that followed, he faced his days with a mix of sadness and clarity. His blindness, initially an unbearable burden, had become an opportunity to re-evaluate his life. Without distractions, he realized how much he had neglected his own emotional needs in pursuit of empty accomplishments. William had transformed his house into a quiet refuge after breaking up with Victoria. Still dealing with his temporary blindness and emotional scars, he preferred isolation. Emily, his loyal assistant, suggested hiring someone to help him with daily tasks while she managed the business, but he hesitated. After much insistence, he agreed. "Hire whoever you want, but keep the interference in my routine to a minimum." When Grace entered the house carrying a simple bag and a cautious look, William didn't know it was her. His blindness had deprived him of the immediate recognition, but the silence that settled when he heard her voice made something inside him stir. "I'm Grace, sent by the agency. I'm here to help." The formality in her introduction concealed the emotional storm she was feeling as she saw him in this condition. On the first day, Grace kept a low profile. She organized the space, placing frequently used items within his reach. She changed the sheets to a light lavender-scented set and adjusted the lighting, even though William couldn't see. When he called her to thank her, she sensed his reserve, but also his vulnerability. "You did a good job, Grace, right?" he said hesitantly. "Yes, Mr. Anderson," she replied, not revealing that they had already met. However, each gesture of care was tinged with memories. She wanted redemption, but she knew it would be a long and delicate journey. In the following days, Grace transformed the environment with her silent presence, the aroma of fresh coffee, the subtle touches in the decor, and her attention to every detail conveyed a genuine care. William, initially indifferent, began to notice the difference. The house seemed less heavy, and even his routine became more bearable. There was something in her gestures that contrasted sharply with what he had experienced with Victoria. "Grace," he said one day, during the dinner she had prepared, "you seem to care about things that others consider insignificant. Why?" She hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "I believe it's the little things that make someone feel truly welcome." William pondered that. It was a simple answer, but it carried meaning. He realized that despite his initial resistance, he was starting to open up. They talked more and more. Grace listened attentively as he spoke about his frustrations with blindness and the pressure he had always carried in his life. She didn't offer superficial advice, but her presence was comforting. On a quiet night, during a blackout that made the house even darker, they sat at the table with a candle between them. "Seems like you're in my world now," William remarked, a faint smile on his face. Grace laughed, but her voice carried a melancholic tone. "Maybe I've always been in it. I just didn't realize how much I could learn from it." That conversation opened the door to something deeper. They talked about losses, regrets, and new beginnings. William found in Grace someone who didn't try to fix him, but understood him in a way no one else seemed to be able to. At the same time, Grace felt relief in being able to approach him again, even if in a subtle way. As the weeks went by, Grace showed an almost intuitive ability to anticipate William's needs. It wasn't just her job, it was the way she did it. When he moved cautiously around the house, she would discreetly adjust the furniture to make it easier for him to pass. If he hesitated when finding the utensils on the table, she would position them in a way that allowed him to find them with ease, without ever drawing attention to it. Each gesture seemed filled with a quiet kindness that gradually softened William's rigidity. One afternoon, while he was in the library, struggling to find a book he wanted to listen to, Grace entered without saying a word. She observed him for a few moments before approaching him. "Are you looking for something specific?" she asked, her voice calm. William, who rarely accepted help without reluctance, replied after a pause. "A book, the one I used to read. I can't find it." Grace searched the shelf efficiently, pulling out a volume and placing it in his hands. "This one?" He ran his fingers over the cover, recognizing its texture and title. "Yes, thank you." His gratitude was sincere, but what touched him the most was how she had perceived his frustration before he even expressed it. This pattern repeated itself. Grace went above and beyond her duties, always offering something more, even when he didn't ask. One day, she brought a jasmine plant to the terrace. "I thought the scent might brighten the afternoons here," she said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. William realized it wasn't just the plant that made a difference, it was the gesture. Every small change she introduced seemed aimed at bringing comfort, something he had never known he needed. And, little by little, he began to reflect on what her presence really meant. One night during dinner, he broke the usual silence between them. "Grace, why do you do so much for me? I know this goes beyond what should be your responsibility." She hesitated, as if considering how far she should go with her answer. "Because I know what it's like to feel lost," she said finally. "And because I believe that sometimes people need more than what's expected to find their way back." William didn't answer immediately, but those words stayed with him. He began to realize that the moments shared with Grace, no matter how simple, carried an unexpected meaning. Everyday conversations turned into dialogues that made him think about things he had long avoided. One particularly quiet morning, while Grace was organizing the garden, William, sitting nearby, asked, "Have you always been like this? So attentive, so different?" She stopped for a moment and looked at him. "I used to be very different, William. I think circumstances shape us, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Maybe what you see in me now is what I've been trying to find." The sincerity in her voice unsettled him. He felt a lightness in the conversation, but also an emotional weight he couldn't ignore. It was as if, in some way, they were connected by experiences neither of them could yet name. As the days turned into weeks, William began to question what he really felt for Grace. It wasn't just gratitude or respect. It was something deeper, something that made him look forward to their daily interactions. Grace, in turn, noticed how William's presence made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in a long time. There was a mutual care, not yet admitted, but present in every gesture, every glance. William began to notice that Grace had a gift for calming his turbulent mind. Her presence was comforting, but also intriguing. Every conversation revealed a piece of her, but never enough to form a complete picture. He noticed how, sometimes, she would avert her gaze when talking about herself, as if she were carefully choosing her words. Grace, for her part, struggled against the need to maintain a flawless facade. She knew that William trusted her, but the weight of guilt grew with each passing day. It wasn't that she was lying outright, but there were holes in the story she was constructing about her life. Parts of her past, especially related to what had brought her to this point, remained hidden. One clear example of this arose during a quiet dinner. William casually asked, "And you, Grace, how did you decide to work as an assistant? It seems so far from the person you appear to be." Grace hesitated, adjusting her napkin as if she needed time to gather her thoughts. "Well, I've always liked helping people, and life sometimes takes us to unexpected places." It was a vague answer, and she knew it didn't fully satisfy William's curiosity. However, he didn't press, interpreting her reluctance as humility or even a reluctance to talk about hardships. This idealization on his part made her feel even more trapped. William saw her as someone altruistic, full of admirable qualities, but the truth was more complicated. Grace carried regrets that she preferred to forget. Impulsive decisions from her youth, people she had deceived to survive, and the fact that she may have never been completely honest with anyone. Still, Grace showed genuine care in everything she did for William. When he expressed frustration, she listened with patience. When the days were difficult, she found ways to make them lighter, whether with soft background music or small surprises, like preparing his favorite dish without him asking. These gestures came from the heart, not from the need to maintain an image. However, this duality began to weigh heavily on her. William, in his temporary blindness, was relying on more than his eyes to feel the world around him. He began to notice the hesitant tone in Grace's voice at certain moments, the prolonged pauses before answering more personal questions. "Grace, sometimes it seems like you carry something very heavy, something you don't want to share," he commented one day. Her heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "We all carry something, William. Maybe one day I'll tell you." He didn't insist, but the feeling that there was more beneath the surface grew stronger. Grace's dilemma intensified with each passing day. She wanted to be honest, but she feared judgment. What would William think if he knew the truth? And more importantly, would he forgive her for not being transparent from the beginning? The underlying tension between them began to manifest in small moments. A casual comment from William about honesty during a conversation made her frown. A joke she made to lighten the mood seemed to resonate differently, as if they both knew something important was being avoided. The days continued, but the air grew heavier. Grace knew that sooner or later the truth would come to light, and when it did, she feared that everything they had built would crumble. William felt that something in his relationship with Grace was out of place, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. She was attentive and dedicated, and her daily gestures of care didn't go unnoticed. However, there were moments when her presence seemed burdened by a strange energy, as if something hung in the air, invisible and indescribable. He would push those thoughts away, but the feeling of unease persisted, growing slowly like a shadow. On the other hand, Grace struggled to maintain appearances. The guilt she felt for the parts of her story she was hiding was constant. She knew that William was starting to notice her hesitations, but each time she thought about telling him the truth, a wave of fear held her back. Still, her dedication to him was genuine. She helped him with patience, adjusting to his needs even before he verbalized them. It was as though through her actions she was trying to make up for what she couldn't express in words. One cold morning, as Grace was preparing breakfast, William appeared in the kitchen earlier than usual. Do you always wake up before the sun?" he asked, his voice rough from sleep. Grace smiled even though he couldn't see it. "Someone has to make sure you eat something decent before the day starts." William sat down, feeling the warmth of the cup of coffee she had placed in front of him. "You do more for me than anyone else ever has, Grace. Sometimes I wonder why." She paused for a moment, her hands holding the spoon that stirred the oatmeal on the stove. "Maybe because I see something in you that no one else has," she replied, her voice laden with sincerity that left him silent. But even in these moments of apparent connection, William felt that there was something hidden. A part of Grace she wasn't allowing him to know. As this realization deepened, he began to question himself. Was he demanding too much? Or was it possible that his intuition was picking up on something real, something he couldn't articulate? Meanwhile, Grace surrendered to the whirlwind of emotions that accompanied her daily life. Every smile she offered William was filled with meaning, but also with an invisible weight. One particularly difficult night, she helped him find a book in the library and remained silent while he felt the cover with his fingers. He seemed so vulnerable and at the same time so resilient that a wave of tenderness overwhelmed her. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" he suddenly asked, breaking the silence. "I'm not the best at understanding people, but I want to understand you." Grace didn't answer right away. Instead, she adjusted his glasses, a seemingly trivial gesture, but one that contained an emotional complexity they both felt. "Maybe one day," she said softly, leaving the room before he could respond. William began to reflect more on what really mattered. He realized that, even without knowing all the details about Grace, her actions spoke louder than words. The care she showed, the effort to make his days easier, the way she seemed genuinely concerned about his well-being, all of this made him reconsider what it meant to love someone. He realized that love wasn't about appearances, but about the daily choices, the silent gestures that carried deep meaning. Despite this, the tension between them continued to mount. Every conversation, every interaction seemed charged with something unsaid. Both of them felt as though they were walking on thin ice, but neither of them knew how to break the silence without causing an irreparable crack. Grace had just finished setting the table for dinner when the sound of footsteps in the garden caught her attention. It was rare for unannounced visitors to arrive at William's house, especially at that hour. Before she could approach to check, the front door was abruptly opened, and a tall figure, wearing sophisticated heels and carrying a designer bag, crossed the threshold as if she owned the place. "William!" called Victoria, her tone oscillating between authority and familiarity. Grace stood still, watching her for a few seconds before retreating to the kitchen, preferring not to interfere. Even so, the impact of her presence was already felt. William was in the living room, resting in the armchair near the fireplace, when he heard the voice he hadn't heard in months. He recognized it immediately. "Victoria," he said, his tone neutral, almost cold. "What are you doing here?" She approached him, completely ignoring the tone of his question. "I came to see how you're doing, William. It's not like I can ignore what happened between us." Her sweet and penetrating perfume filled the air, but it didn't stir any nostalgia in him, just discomfort. "I didn't know you were interested in knowing how I am," he replied, the subtle irony in his words not lost on her. Victoria ignored the comment and sat down across from him, crossing her legs in a calculated pose. "Of course I care. You've been through so much, and maybe I handled everything wrong." Grace, still in the kitchen, could hear every word, though she tried to appear busy. The superficiality in Victoria's tone was evident, and Grace felt a mix of discomfort and curiosity. It was impossible not to notice the contrast between Victoria's polished elegance and the authentic simplicity that Grace brought to the house. "If you're here to talk about the past, it's already been resolved," William said, cutting off Victoria's speech before she could continue. "There's nothing more to discuss." Victoria let out a nervous laugh, leaning forward as if trying to shrink the distance between them, but it wasn't physical. "William, don't be so cruel. I made mistakes, but you know we had a bond. I can still be everything you need." It was then that Grace entered, carrying a tray with tea, seemingly unaware of the tension in the room. "William, I thought you might want something to drink," she said softly but firmly, a strategic intervention that cut through the dynamic between him and Victoria. Victoria looked her up and down, evaluating her quickly with a critical look. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice laced with disdain. "Grace," she replied, not intimidated. "I work here helping Mr. Anderson." Her posture was impeccable, but her eyes betrayed the intensity with which she felt the situation. William intervened. "Grace has been an invaluable help, especially when I needed genuine support." The emphasis in his words didn't go unnoticed, and Victoria stiffened. She knew she was losing ground. "So this is it?" she said, standing up abruptly. "You really think you can move on with this?" William stood up calmly, facing her. "Yes, Victoria, I do, because now I see clearly what I didn't see before. True love and support don't come from rehearsed words or flawless appearances. They come from actions, from presence, from sincerity, things you never knew how to offer." Victoria tried to retort, but he raised his hand, interrupting her. "Please, leave. I don't want anything more from you. I don't want to carry this illusion any longer." Victoria left in a hurry, her dignity shattered with every step. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, and the guests began to murmur words of support. Grace, who had remained firm throughout the scene, approached William, gently touching his face with tenderness. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, concerned. "I'm more than okay," he replied, holding her hand, "because now I know I made the right decision." Turning to the guests, William took a deep breath and declared aloud, "This is the moment that marks the end of my past and the beginning of a future with the woman I love." The murmurs among the guests gave way to warm applause as he and Grace prepared to continue the ceremony. William was sitting in the garden, enjoying the scent of jasmine carried by the breeze. His vision was slowly returning, allowing him to distinguish shadows and shapes. He watched Grace, who was nearby, carefully pruning a plant. Something in her posture, the way she moved, awakened a memory. It was as if he had seen that scene before, but in another place, under very different circumstances. "Grace," he called, his voice firm but filled with curiosity. "Come here, please." She approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, William?" "How long are you going to keep your secrets?" he asked directly, without hesitation. He had felt for months that she was hiding something, but now the memory that had been bothering him for so long began to clear. The way she held her tense shoulders, the way she avoided certain topics, everything was connecting. Grace froze for a moment, her heart racing. "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, trying to stay calm, but her voice betrayed a slight tremor. William narrowed his eyes, as if trying to see her more clearly, even with his still blurry vision. "You're the woman I rescued from the sea, aren't you? The one who disappeared without explanation." She looked away, unable to hold his intense gaze. Her mind raced, searching for an answer, but deep down, she knew she could no longer escape. "Yes," she confessed, her voice low. "It's me." The silence that followed was suffocating. William leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you show up here like you were a stranger?" Grace took a deep breath, gathering the courage to speak. "Because I was scared. Scared of how you'd react, how you'd judge me if you knew who I really was." She started walking around the garden, her arms crossed as if needing to protect herself. "Back then I was running away. My life was a mess. I made choices I'm ashamed of, William. And when you saved me, it felt like I had a chance to start over." William remained silent, absorbing her words. Finally, he asked, "And why did you come here? Why did you accept to work for me?" She stopped and looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Because I wanted to repay what you did for me. You risked your life to save mine, even though you didn't know me. But the more time I spent here, the harder it became to tell the truth. I didn't want to lose this." Her voice faltered, and she gestured toward him and the house around them, as if trying to encompass everything they had built. William felt a mix of emotions: anger at the deception, compassion for what she had endured, and a growing respect for the courage she was finally showing. "You left me in the dark, Grace. But at the same time, I see that everything you've done here has been sincere. I can't ignore that." Grace felt a thread of hope in his words. "I know I'm asking a lot, but I hope one day you can forgive me. I never meant to deceive you, William. I just wanted to be worthy of your trust." William stood up, walking toward her with slow steps. "You've done more for me than anyone else, Grace, and while I'm still processing everything, one thing is clear. What really matters isn't what you hid, but what you've shown every day." He extended his hand, gently touching her shoulder. "I forgive you." Grace closed her eyes, letting the tears fall. It was as if an immense weight had been lifted from her shoulders. William didn't just forgive her. He saw her for who she truly was. The months following the revelation of Grace's past brought a period of rebuilding for both her and William. The honesty finally established between them not only strengthened their bond, but also gave them the courage to plan a future together. When William suggested that they should get married, Grace's reaction was a mix of surprise and emotion. "Are you sure?" she asked, her eyes filled with tears. "You know everything about me now. Aren't you afraid of what people might say?" William held her hands firmly. "What people think has never mattered. What matters is what we've built together. I want the world to know that you are the woman I've chosen to stand by my side." Thus, the preparations for the wedding began. Unlike the extravagant event William had once planned with Victoria, he and Grace opted for something more intimate. The ceremony would be outdoors, at a secluded farm, surrounded by flowering fields and centuries-old trees. Grace was involved in every detail, but with simplicity and care, reflecting the authenticity that now defined their relationship. On the day of the ceremony, the location was stunning. The white chairs were lined up on the lawn, the altar decorated with wildflowers, and a light breeze seemed to bless the moment. William, dressed in a classic suit, waited at the altar, visibly emotional. He could feel his heart racing, but also an inner calm, something he had never experienced before. When Grace began to walk down the aisle, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, all eyes turned to her. Her dress was simple, yet elegant, and the smile on her face revealed more than happiness. It showed overcoming. William couldn't take his eyes off her. It was as though the rest of the world had disappeared. However, the harmony was broken when a familiar figure appeared among the guests. Victoria, dressed in a sophisticated outfit and carrying a determined expression, made her way down the aisle, drawing glances and whispers. Grace stopped for a moment, surprised, but maintained her composure. Victoria, on the other hand, had no intention of being unnoticed. "William, you can't do this," Victoria said, interrupting the ceremony with a voice that mixed desperation and determination. "You know this isn't right, not after everything we had." The guests fell silent, shocked by the interruption. William, initially stunned, took a deep breath and took a few steps forward. "Victoria, this is not your fight," he said, with a firmness that left no doubt about his position. "You lost your place in my life when you chose appearances over substance, and now nothing you say can change that." Victoria tried to approach, but he raised his hand, stopping her. Enough. This is my day, our day, he said, looking at Grace, who remained serene but vigilant. I chose Grace because she showed me what true love is, something we never had. William's public rejection was final and absolute. Victoria, realizing there was no longer any space for her there, hurried out, her dignity shattered. The tension in the air slowly dissipated, and the guests began to murmur words of support. Grace, who had remained steadfast throughout the scene, approached William, gently touching his face with tenderness. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked, concerned. "I'm more than okay," he replied, holding her hand. "Because now I know I made the right decision." Turning to the guests, William took a deep breath and declared aloud, "This is the moment that marks the end of my past and the beginning of a future with the woman I love." The murmurs among the guests gave way to warm applause as he and Grace prepared to continue the ceremony. The ceremony, resumed after Victoria's interruption, continued with an atmosphere of renewed complicity. The open sky seemed to bless the moment with orange hues, and the soft sound of the wind through the trees brought calm to the attendees. William stood next to Grace, but something in his expression indicated that there was still more to be said. He held her hand, looking deeply into her eyes. "Grace," he began, his voice firm but filled with emotion, "before we proceed with the traditional vows, there's something I want to say." The guests murmured softly, but quickly silenced as they sensed the gravity of the moment. Grace looked at him, her heart racing, but her eyes confident. William let out a deep breath and continued, "You came into my life unexpectedly, first as a coincidence, then as a constant. I took time to realize, but it was in your gestures, in your patience, and in your courage that I found the true meaning of love. There is nothing about you that I would want to change. In fact, it's the entirety of who you are that makes me want to be a better man." He released her hand and with a smooth motion took a small velvet box from his inner suit pocket. The guests' reactions were immediate, full of surprise. William knelt in front of Grace, never taking his eyes off hers. "I already knew this would be our day, but now I want it to begin in the most special way possible. Grace, will you marry me? Not just today, but every day to come." Grace brought her hands to her face, feeling the tears accumulate. William's sincerity was disarming. He saw her completely, her flaws, her past, and her qualities, and still he chose her without hesitation. For a moment she lost her words, nodding frantically as the tears streamed down her face. Finally, she managed to whisper, "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The guests erupted in applause, some discreetly wiping their eyes in response to the emotional scene. Emily, William's faithful assistant, was among them, smiling proudly. It was clear to everyone that what they were witnessing wasn't just a social event, but a union founded on something genuine and rare. William placed the ring on Grace's finger, a simple yet elegant design that reflected her essence. When he stood, the two of them faced each other, both visibly emotional. He gently held her face, ignoring the applause around them, and kissed her softly. The kiss was not only a celebration, but a silent promise of a future built in partnership and unconditional love. The ceremony continued with the formal vows, but no one doubted that the most important moment had already occurred. When they reached the end, the two of them looked at the guests, now as a pledged couple, and the applause doubled. Grace could hardly believe the warmth coming from the people around them, who celebrated not only the wedding, but the authenticity of that love. William felt a weight disappear from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he was free from expectations that weren't his own. By Grace's side, he finally felt ready to begin a new journey. As they walked together down the aisle, they exchanged a glance that didn't need words. It was the look of two people who knew that, despite the challenges, they had found in each other what mattered most: a home. The soft sound of the waves breaking on the beach and the warm sea breeze from Miami created the perfect setting for William and Grace's simple and intimate wedding. The white sand stretched beneath the bare feet of the few guests, while the sky, tinged with orange and pink, seemed to bless the moment with its unique beauty. There was no excessive luxury, no grand ostentation, just the essentials to reflect the essence of the couple. Grace, wearing a light lace dress that danced with the wind, walked slowly toward the makeshift altar. Her eyes were fixed on William, who was waiting for her with a smile that mixed emotion and admiration. He, in turn, wore a simple yet elegant white linen shirt, reflecting the tranquility and serenity that now defined his life. The look they exchanged when she reached the altar spoke more than any vow could express. During the ceremony, the two made sure to personalize their vows, recalling their individual journeys and how the challenges had prepared them to be together in that moment. William spoke with a firm voice, but one filled with emotion. "Grace, life has taught me that the most valuable things can't be bought or planned. They come unexpectedly, just like you came to me. Today, before the sea that witnessed our beginning, I promise to be to you what you have been to me, a reason to believe, a safe place." With tears in her eyes, Grace replied with a voice choked with emotion. "William, when we met, I was a broken reflection of who I wanted to be. But you gave me space to grow and see myself fully. I promise to walk beside you with the same love and care you've taught me to recognize." After the kiss that sealed the ceremony, the guests, composed of close friends and family, celebrated warmly. The reception followed at a seaside restaurant where soft music and laughter filled the night. Months later, William's mansion, once a space full of opulence, had become a welcoming home. Grace had brought life to the place, decorating the rooms with simple items full of meaning. Photographs of happy moments now adorned the walls, and the scent of fresh flowers was constant. William, who once saw the house as a symbol of status, now saw it as a refuge, a place where love and joy were palpable. The emotional connection they shared grew stronger every day. William learned to appreciate the small gestures, how Grace waited for him with a cup of tea at the end of the day, or how their nighttime conversations always ended with a look that said everything that didn't need to be spoken. Grace, for her part, found in William a partner who encouraged her to be herself, without fear of judgment. Together, they decided they wanted to use their fortune meaningfully. Instead of expanding the business or acquiring more properties, they invested in projects to help underserved communities in Mexico. They created educational programs for youth, supported local fishermen in Miami, and partnered with NGOs to improve healthcare access in remote areas. During the inauguration of a community center, William addressed the audience. "I've learned that true success isn't in accumulating wealth, but in sharing it. We're here today because we believe that together we can create opportunities and change lives." Grace watched him from the audience, her heart filled with pride and love. That man, who once was consumed by ambition, was now the embodiment of generosity and purpose. And she knew that together they could continue transforming not just their lives, but those of many others. At the end of the event, as they walked hand in hand along the beach, the same sea that had been the stage for so many changes now seemed a silent witness to their legacy. Grace rested her head on William's shoulder and smiled. "I never thought life could be like this," she said, "and to think it all started that day in the sea." William smiled softly and replied, "Maybe destiny always knew where we should be. We just needed to find our way here."